The waves of the Tyrrhenian Sea slammed hard against the rocky cliffs of Sicily. The sound was steady and loud, like a heartbeat that wouldn't stop. It used to calm Vincenzo Enzo Moretti. It used to give him peace. But tonight the air felt different. The salty breeze burned his throat, sharp and bitter, almost like the taste of blood. In his right hand, he held a gold-plated beretta, a relic of a life defined by cold precision. In his left, he held the trembling hand of Lucia, the only woman who had ever seen the man behind the monster. "You promised," Enzo, she whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the dark. "Don't let the cancer take the parts of me you loved. Let me go while I still recognize your face." The man who had built an empire on corpses found himself paralyzed. He had survived hits in Palermo and federal indictments in Miami, but he could not survive this. As he looked into her fatting eyes, a desperate, reckless lie took root in his mind, a heist not for money or power, but for time. He let the gun clatter to the marble floor and collapsed to his knees, clutching his chest with a performance that would have shamed a Verdi tenor. "I can't, Lucia," he wheezed, forcing a cold sweat to break across his brow. "Because the doctors, they told me this morning. I am going with you." It was the greatest lie the Don had ever told. And as Lucia pulled his head to her breast, weeping with a tragic sort of relief, Enzo realized he had just traded one death sentence for another. If you love powerful mafia romances filled with loyalty, betrayal, and unforgettable love stories, drop a comment, subscribe, and join the family as I continue the story. The scent of jasmine always preceded Lucia into a room, a floral ghost that had haunted Enzo's senses since they were 10 years old, stealing lemons from the orchards of Corleone. But tonight, the jasmine was choked by the sterile, metallic tang of the medicine she had tried to hide in the vanity drawer. They sat on the terrace of their Sicilian villa, the moon casting a silver shroud over the Mediterranean. It was the kind of night meant for expensive wine and the comfortable silence of a 50-year marriage. Instead, the air was heavy with a finality that no amount of mafia muscle could intimidate. Lucia didn't lead with tears. She was the daughter of a Don and the wife of a legend. She led with a folder. She placed the oncology report on the iron-wrought table between them, her fingers steady despite the pallor of her skin. "The doctors in Palermo are very thorough, Enzo," she said, her voice like crushed velvet. "They use words like aggressive and unresponsive. I prefer the word finished." Enzo didn't reach for the papers. If he didn't touch them, the ink wouldn't be real. If he didn't read the Latin names of the cells devouring his world, he could still believe they were just retired, just old, just resting. He kept his hands clasped over his stomach, feeling the phantom ache of a bullet wound he'd taken for her in '88. He would take 1,000 more if it could bleed this sickness out of her. "We will fly to New York," Enzo said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "The Mayo Clinic. I will buy the hospital, Lucia. I will put the best minds in the world in one room until they find the answer." "The answer is sitting right in front of you," she countered, leaning forward into the candlelight. The flame danced in her dark eyes, reflecting a fire that even the illness hadn't extinguished. "I have watched my father wither into a shadow. I watched your brother lose his mind to the morphine until he didn't know his own children. I will not be a body that people pity, Enzo. I will not be a secret kept in a darkened room while guards stand outside the door to keep death away. Death is already in the room. He is sitting at the table with us." She reached across the table, covering his weathered, scarred hand with her own. Her skin was cool, a terrifying contrast to the humid Sicilian night. "I need a favor," she whispered. "The kind of favor you used to grant for loyalty, the kind you granted for blood." Enzo felt a cold dread settle in his marrow. He had anticipated many things in his retirement: betrayal by young upstarts, a quiet heart attack while gardening, perhaps even a trial for sins long buried. But he had never prepared for this. "Anything," he said, the word a reflex. When the pain becomes louder than my memories, Lucia said, her gaze unwavering, I want you to end it. I want to fall asleep in this bed in this house, looking at the sea. I want it to be quick. I want it to be clean. And I want it to be you. The silence that followed was deafening. The cicadas in the olive grove seemed to stop their drumming. Enzo pulled his hand back as if burned. The Don who had once cleared a path through the Miami underworld with a shotgun now felt like a trembling child. He looked at the woman who had laundered his blood-stained shirts, who had raised his children while he was in hiding, and who had been his only North Star in a life of moral darkness. You are asking me to kill my soul, he choked out. I am asking you to protect it, she corrected. You have spent your life being a shield for this family. Be my shield one last time. Don't let the cancer humiliate me. Swear it, Enzo. Give me the last vow. He stood up abruptly, the chair screeching against the stone floor. He walked to the edge of the terrace, looking out at the lights of the fishing boats bobbing in the distance. To any observer, he was still the formidable Morty, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, a man whose shadow carried the weight of 1,000 secrets, but inside he was fracturing. He thought of the Beretta in the safe downstairs. He thought of the steady hand he had prided himself on for 40 years. How could he use that hand to stop the heart that beat in rhythm with his own? The paradox was a cruelty he couldn't grasp. To love her meant to kill her. To save her meant to let her suffer. He turned back to her. She hadn't moved. She sat there with the poise of a queen awaiting an ambassador, but he saw the slight tremor in her chin. She was terrified not of death, but of the loss of herself. I cannot live in a world where you are gone, Lucia, he said, his voice breaking. You have survived everything else, she said softly. You will survive the silence too. But Enzo knew he wouldn't. He looked at the medical folder, then back at his wife. The gears of his mind, the same gears that had orchestrated complex heists and outmaneuvered federal agents, began to turn with a desperate, frantic energy. He couldn't refuse her the vow, her dignity was his religion, but he couldn't fulfill it and remain behind. In that moment of crushing grief, the seed of his great deception was planted. If she wanted a partner in the end, he would give her one. He would construct a lie so beautiful, so tragic, that she would never have to feel the guilt of leaving him behind, and he would never have to face the cold reality of the silence she promised. He stepped back to the table and sank into his chair. He took her hand again, squeezing it until his knuckles went white. I swear it, he whispered, the lie already forming like a bitter pill on his tongue. We will do this on your terms. But Lucia, there is something I haven't told you. Something the doctors told me when I went for my checkup in the city. The trap was set. He saw the flicker of concern in her eyes, a shift from her own tragedy to his. It was the opening he needed. He would become the victim to save the victim. I am not going to survive you, he lied, his voice gaining a sudden theatrical strength. Because I am dying too. Lucia's breath hitched, her eyes widening as she searched his face for the truth he had spent a lifetime hiding. In the dark romanticism of the Sicilian night, the Don began his final, most dangerous performance. The lie had been spoken, and once a word left Enzo Morty's lips, it became a mountain he was forced to climb. As Lucia wept against his shoulder, tears no longer for her own fading light, but for the supposed darkening of his, Enzo felt the sickening weight of his cowardice masquerading as devotion. He held her tightly, smelling the jasmine in her hair, and realized that for the first time in 50 years, he was no longer her protector. He was her greatest deceiver. By dawn, the Mediterranean was a bruised purple, and Lucia had finally fallen into a shallow, fitful sleep. Enzo slipped out of their bed, his movements practiced and silent, the ghost of the man who once moved through high-security vaults without tripping a single wire. He didn't go to the kitchen for espresso. He went to the basement, to a heavy mahogany desk that smelled of old cedar and gunpowder. He picked up a burner phone, his thumb hovering over a contact he hadn't touched in a decade. Dr. Aris Vajuva was a man of medicine only in the sense that he knew how to stitch a bullet wound without alerting the authorities. He was a creature of the shadows, a man who lived in the space between the pharmacy and the black market. The call was picked up on the second ring. Don Morty, Vajuva's voice was like dry parchment rubbing together. I thought you were dead or holy by now. Neither, Enzo rasped, staring at a framed photograph of Lucia on his desk, taken the day they arrived in Miami in 1982. She was laughing, her hair caught in the sea breeze. I need a miracle, Aris, not the kind from God, the kind from a printer. 2 hours later, Enzo was driving his vintage Alfa Romeo through the winding, dusty backroads toward a nondescript clinic on the outskirts of Palermo. The heat was already beginning to shimmer off the asphalt, making the olive trees look like dancing spirits. His heart hammered against his ribs, not from the thrill of the crime, but from the terrifying realization that he was about to commit a sacrilege. To fake a death sentence while his wife lived a real one felt like spitting in the face of the Almighty. The clinic was a crumbling limestone building draped in dying ivy. Inside, the air was stagnant, smelling of rubbing alcohol and cheap tobacco. Dr. Vajuva sat behind a desk cluttered with patient files that likely belonged to men who were already buried in unmarked graves. He was a thin, skeletal man with yellowed fingers and eyes that saw only currency. You look remarkably healthy for a man seeking a terminal diagnosis, Enzo, Vajuva said, gesturing for him to sit. Enzo didn't sit. He placed a heavy leather envelope on the desk. Inside was 50,000 euros in clean, unmarked bills, a down payment on a fantasy. I don't need a checkup, Aris. I need a history. I need blood work that shows a heart failing. I need x-rays with shadows where there should be light. I need a timeline that mirrors my wife's. Vajuva opened the envelope, his eyes flickering over the cash. He let out a long, slow whistle. Lucia, I heard the rumors. I am sorry, Don Morty, truly. But this is a dangerous theater. If your family finds out, if the commission thinks you are weak and dying, they will circle the villa like sharks. Let them circle, Enzo snapped, his voice cracking. The world outside that villa doesn't exist anymore. There is only her. She asked me for a promise I cannot fulfill alone. She wants us to leave together, but I am cursed with a heart that won't stop beating for her. So you will give me the papers. You will give me the bottles of placebos. You will give me the script for my own execution. Vajuva sighed, reaching for a keyboard. It will take time to forge the digital trail. The Palermo hospitals share databases now. I have to hack the central registry, swap your healthy stats for those of a patient who passed last week. It's a lot of digital blood on my hands. Then wash them with the money, Enzo said, leaning over the desk until he was inches from the doctor's face. But it has to be perfect. Lucia is not a fool. She has spent her life spotting a lie from a kilometer away. If she suspects this is a stunt, I lose her before she even dies. Do you understand? Vajuva nodded, his fingers already dancing across the keys. It will be a masterpiece of misery, Enzo. By tomorrow, you will officially be a man with 6 months to live. A failing aortic valve, perhaps. It's poetic. A broken heart, clinically speaking. Enzo walked out of the clinic into the blinding Sicilian sun, feeling a strange, hollow lightness. He had done it. He had bought a ticket to a funeral that wasn't his. When he returned to the villa, the house was quiet. He found Lucia in the garden, sitting in a wicker chair, staring out at the sea. She looked smaller today, as if the news of his illness had physically compressed her. When she heard his footsteps, she turned, and the look of profound, tragic empathy in her eyes nearly brought him to his knees. "Where were you?" she asked softly. "The clinic," he said, the lie sliding out with practiced ease. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small amber bottle Vajuva had given him, filled with nothing but sugar pills. "They gave me these, to manage the pressure." Lucia stood up, her legs wobbly, and crossed the grass to him. She took the bottle from his hand, her thumb tracing the label with his name on it. She didn't look angry. She looked relieved. It was the most horrific thing Enzo had ever seen. She was relieved that he was dying because it meant she wouldn't have to be alone in the dark. God is merciful in a strange way, she whispered, leaning her head against his chest. He knew I couldn't go without you. He's letting us walk through the gate together, Enzo. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her so tightly he feared he might break her fragile ribs. He looked over her head at the sparkling water, the beautiful, eternal Mediterranean that didn't care about the lies of men. He had fixed death, or so he thought. He had neutralized the threat of his own survival. But as he felt the steady, powerful thrum of his own healthy heart beating against her weakening one, he realized the true cost of his gambit. He wasn't just faking an illness, he was faking a soul. He was a ghost in a living man's body, trapped in a lie that required him to watch the woman he loved fade away, all while pretending to fade alongside her. He had won the heist. He had stolen the guilt from her heart and placed it on his own. But as he looked at the bottle of sugar pills in her hand, he knew that the hardest part of the performance was yet to come. He would have to learn how to look like a man who was losing his life, while in reality, he was only losing his mind. "We'll be okay," he lied, kissing her forehead. "Just a little longer, Lucia, we go together." And in the silence of the garden, the only sound was the lie echoing back from the cliffs, hollow and cold. The dining room of the Villa Morti was a cathedral of memories, its high vaulted ceilings catching the flicker of a dozen beeswax candles. Enzo had spent the afternoon meticulously preparing for a performance that would have horrified his younger, more stoic self. He had skipped lunch to ensure a natural pallor, spent an hour in the sun to induce a light-headedness he could exploit, and practiced the precise angle of a fall that wouldn't actually break his hip. It was a heist of the heart, and the marks were the woman he loved and the ghost of his own integrity. Lucia sat across from him, draped in a shawl of midnight blue that made her skin look like translucent porcelain. She was eating little, a bit of grilled sea bass, a sip of mineral water, but her eyes were fixed on him with a terrifying, soulful intensity. Since the diagnosis from Dr. Vajuva, she hadn't looked at him as a husband or a protector, but as a fellow traveler on a dark road. There was a newfound intimacy in her gaze that felt like a hot iron against Enzo's conscience. "You're not eating your risotto, Enzo," she said softly, her fork pausing midair. "Is it the nausea? The doctor said the pressure in your chest might make you lose your appetite." Enzo looked down at the creamy rice, gilded with saffron. He was starving, but he pushed the plate away with a manufactured groan. "It's just heavy, Lucia. Everything feels heavy lately, like I am carrying the weight of the house on my ribs." He saw the way her hand trembled as she reached for her water. He saw the flicker of pain in her expression, not for herself, but for the man she believed was crumbling beside her. It was the perfect moment. The stage was set, the lighting was dim, and the audience was captive to her own grief. Enzo began the movement. He focused on the pulse in his neck, forcing his breathing to become shallow and ragged. He let his eyelids flutter, a subtle sign of vertigo that drew her focus instantly. "Enzo," she asked, her voice rising an octave. "Enzo, look at me." He didn't look at her. Instead, he stared at a point just above her head, as if watching something invisible and terrifying. He let his hand, the one scarred by 100 street fights, slide off the table with a dull thud. Then, with a practiced relaxation of his core, he let his body tilt. The crash was louder than he intended. The chair tipped backward, the wood groaning as it hit the marble floor, and Enzo went with it. He landed on his side, his head lolling back, his eyes rolling toward the ceiling in a hollow imitation of a man losing his grip on the physical world. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of the wind rattling the terrace doors. Then, a cry tore from Lucia's throat, a sound of such raw, unadulterated agony that Enzo almost broke character then and there. "Enzo, no, no, no." He heard the scrape of her chair, the frantic patter of her slippers on the stone. She was on the floor beside him in seconds, her hands cold and trembling as they cupped his face. She wasn't strong enough to lift him, but she pulled his head into her lap, her tears falling hot and fast onto his cheeks. "Breathe, Enzo, please. Just breathe for me," she sobbed. Her fingers searched for his pulse, and he had to consciously slow his heart rate, holding his breath until his lungs burned, giving her just enough of a flutter to convince her the engine was failing. He stayed under for as long as he could bear. He listened to her pray, not the formal prayers of the church, but the desperate, jagged bargains of a woman who was losing her last anchor. She promised God she wouldn't complain about her own pain if he just gave Enzo a little more time. She promised to be brave if they could just reach the end together. Finally, Enzo allowed a long, shuddering gasp to escape his lips. He let his eyes focus on her, feigning a deep, disoriented confusion. "Lucia," he whispered, his voice cracking naturally from the dryness of his throat. What happened?" "You collapsed, my love," she said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, though the tears wouldn't stop. She looked exhausted, her face a mask of tragic relief. "Your heart, it gave out for a moment." He allowed her to help him sit up, leaning heavily against the ruins of the dinner table. He felt like a monster. He saw the way she looked at him, not with the fear of a widow, but with the grim solidarity of a soldier in a foxhole. "I am sorry," he said, and for once the words were true. "I didn't mean to scare you." "Don't be sorry," she whispered, leaning her forehead against his. "I was so afraid you were going to leave me behind tonight. I was afraid you'd go first and leave me here alone." She took his hand and pressed it to her own chest, right over her heart. "Do you feel that? We're in rhythm, Enzo. Even our sicknesses are in sync. We really are partners in this, aren't we? Partners in death." The phrase felt like a curse. Enzo looked into her eyes and saw a terrifying peace settling over her. His feint had achieved exactly what he wanted. It had removed her fear of being the one to break his heart. Now she believed they were crossing the finish line hand in hand. She was comforted by the lie that he was dying with her, and that comfort was the cruelest gift he had ever given her. He helped her up, his strong arms belying the frailty he was supposed to be feeling. They walked slowly toward the bedroom, two shadows moving through a house that felt increasingly like a tomb. As he tucked her into bed and watched her drift into a sleep brought on by emotional exhaustion, Enzo sat in the armchair by the window. He looked at his hands in the moonlight. They were steady. His heart was strong. He was a man in the prime of his senior years, capable of walking miles, of lifting heavy weights, of living for another 2 decades. But as he listened to Lucia's labored breathing, he realized the theater wouldn't end tonight. He would have to faint again. He would have to grow weaker, as she did. He would have to match her step for step into a grave he wasn't ready for. He had wanted to spare her the guilt of his loneliness, but in doing so, he had trapped himself in a prison of his own making. He was now a man who had to pray for his own decline to keep a dying woman's heart from breaking. The first feint had been a success. The deception was absolute. And as the sun began to peek over the Sicilian horizon, Enzo Moretti realized that the greatest heist of his life was also his most certain execution. He wasn't just faking death. He was inviting it to sit at his bedside until it became real. The morning arrived with a clarity that Enzo found insulting. The sun was too bright, the sea too blue, and his own body felt disturbingly robust. After a night of feigning a fragile heart, his muscles were coiled with an energy he had to actively suppress. He sat on the terrace, nursing a cup of espresso and watching the light hit the lemon groves, when the gravel of the driveway crunched under the weight of a heavy sedan. He didn't need to look to know who it was. Silvio the Ghost Moretti, no relation by blood but a brother by 1,000 oaths, had a way of arriving exactly when the air turned sour. As the retired consigliere stepped out of the car, adjusting his linen suit over a frame that had remained whip-thin despite 80 years of life, Enzo felt the first prickle of genuine sweat on his neck. Silvio didn't see with his eyes. He saw with his instincts. You look like a man who has seen a priest, Enzo, Silvio called out, his voice a dry rasp that sounded like wind over desert sand. He climbed the stairs of the terrace with a cane he didn't truly need, his sharp, predatory eyes scanning the scene before he even reached the table. Silvio, Enzo greeted, standing up with a deliberate, slow groan, clutching the arm of his chair as if his balance were a precious, fleeting thing. You're early for the funeral. Lucia is still resting. Silvio sank into the chair opposite Enzo, placing his silver-topped cane against the table. He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't offer comfort. He simply stared at Enzo for a long, uncomfortable minute. I heard the news. The village is whispering that the Lion of Corleone and his queen are stepping into the mist together, a tragedy for the ages, the kind of thing they write operas about. It is what it is, Silvio, Enzo said, leaning back and closing his eyes as if the light pained him. The heart wants what it wants, even when it's stopping. Silvio reached into his breast pocket and pulled out 2 thick, hand-rolled cigars. He tossed one onto the table toward Enzo. Then a dying man won't mind a bit of smoke. One for the road, eh? Enzo hesitated. A man with a failing aortic valve and respiratory distress should have recoiled at the sight of heavy tobacco, but the craving hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't smoked in 3 days to maintain the charade for Lucia, and his nerves were frayed to the breaking point. He looked at the cigar, dark, oily, and fragrant, and then at Silvio's unblinking gaze. "Just one," Enzo muttered, reaching for it. He clipped the end with a steady hand, too steady. He caught himself and forced a slight tremor into his fingers as he struck the match. As they sat in silence, the rich blue smoke curling into the Sicilian air, a maid brought out a tray of breakfast. Enzo had instructed the staff to bring him only dry toast and tea when Lucia was present, but Lucia was asleep and his stomach was screaming. The tray held esfincion, thick Sicilian pizza topped with onions, anchovies, and Caciocavallo cheese, and a bowl of fresh figs. Enzo tried to ignore the scent. He took a sip of the bitter tea, but the hunger was an animal. He looked at Silvio, who was daintily peeling a fig, and then he looked at the pizza. "A man needs fuel to fight the shadows." "No," Silvio remarked, his voice devoid of inflection. Enzo broke. He reached for a square of the esfincion, then another. He ate with a ferocity that belied his supposed condition, the salt and fat grounding him in a reality he was trying so hard to escape. He washed it down with a gulp of the espresso, leaning back with a sigh of genuine satisfaction. Silvio watched the entire display. He watched the way Enzo's chest expanded with a deep, healthy lungful of smoke. He watched the way Enzo's eyes regained their sharpness, the predatory glint of a man who still had decades of fire left in him. "You know," Enzo, Silvio said softly, tapping the ash from his cigar, "I remember a hit we did in New Jersey, 1974. You took a slug to the shoulder and finished your steak before you let the doctor dig it out. You always had a remarkable appetite for a man in pain." Enzo froze, a piece of fig halfway to his mouth. "The body compensates, Silvio. It's the adrenaline of the end." "Is it?" Silvio leaned forward, the silver head of his cane catching the sun. "Because I spent 40 years reading men's faces to see if they were lying to the commission. I've watched men plead for their lives, and I've watched them accept their deaths. You don't look like a man accepting his death, Enzo. You look like a man who is running a very expensive, very dangerous con." "Careful, Silvio," Enzo warned, his voice dropping into the low, dangerous register that had once silenced entire boardrooms. "Even old friends can overstep." "I am not overstepping. I am observing," Silvio countered, unfazed. "A dying man doesn't smoke a Churchill with that much enthusiasm. A dying man doesn't eat enough onions to choke a horse. And a dying man certainly doesn't have a pulse at his neck that's beating as steady as a Swiss watch." Silvio stood up, his gaze moving toward the house, where Lucia's bedroom window was draped in lace. "She believes you. I saw it in the way she looked at you when I arrived. She thinks you are her partner in the great beyond. But if you are faking this, Enzo, if you are letting her mourn you while you are perfectly healthy, you are committing a sin far worse than any hit we ever ordered. Enzo felt the pizza turn to lead in his stomach. The mask slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing the raw, jagged fear beneath. I can't let her go alone, Silvio. I can't let her feel the weight of leaving me. If she thinks I am coming, she's at peace. Isn't that what love is? A beautiful lie to keep the cold out. No, Silvio said, his voice cold and sharp. That's what a coward tells himself to avoid the grief. Love is standing on the dock and waving until the boat is out of sight, even if you're the one left in the rain. Silvio turned to leave, his cane clicking rhythmically against the stone. He stopped at the top of the stairs and looked back. Keep your theater, Enzo. But remember, the problem with faking a death is that eventually the audience expects a body. And Lucia is the smartest woman I've ever known. She'll smell the cigar smoke on your breath before the week is out. As the sedan disappeared back down the drive, Enzo sat alone in the debris of his breakfast. The cigar had gone cold. The esfinchen tasted like ash. He looked at his hands, truly trembling now. Silvio was right. He was playing a game with a master player, and the stakes weren't just his reputation. They were the final moments of the only person who had ever made his life worth living. He stood up and walked toward the house, his heart beating with a terrifying, robust health that felt like a betrayal. He had to go to Lucia. He had to wash his face, brush away the scent of life, and prepare to be a dying man once more. The stillness of the afternoon was shattered not by the slow tolling of a bell, but by the abrasive roar of a high-performance engine screaming up the coastal road. Enzo, who had been practicing a labored, shallow breathing technique in the library, stiffened as the screech of tires echoed through the villa's courtyard. Before he could even adjust his robe to look more like an invalid, the heavy oak doors swung open with a violence that suggested the world outside was no longer willing to respect his sanctuary of secrets. Dante Morti burst into the foyer like a tropical storm. He was the image of Enzo 40 years ago, dark-eyed, restless, and radiating a volatile charisma, but dressed in the loud, expensive silks of a Miami prince. His jaw was set in a way that signaled trouble, and his breathing was fast, his expensive leather jacket dusted with the grime of a frantic journey. "No," Dante shouted, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. He didn't wait for a greeting. He crossed the distance in 3 strides, looking at Enzo with a mix of desperation and the raw, unpolished fury of the youth. "I need the keys to the safe house in Trapani. Now. And I need a clean car." Enzo stood slowly, forcing his limbs to move with a heavy, artificial lethargy. He felt the robust strength in his legs, the strength he was supposed to be losing, and hated it. "Lower your voice, Dante. Your grandmother is sleeping. She is ill." Dante paused, his eyes flickering with a momentary guilt that was quickly buried by his own panic. "I know she's sick. That's why I am here. Well, part of why. But the Valenti brothers, they're 2 hours behind me, maybe less. I made a move in South Beach, Nano. A move I thought was smart. It wasn't." Enzo felt a cold, familiar iron settle in his gut. For a moment, the fake dying man vanished, replaced by the Don who had once held the Miami coast in a velvet fist. He looked at his grandson, his only heir, a boy who had inherited the family's fire but none of its patience, and saw the heat he had brought to their doorstep. "You brought a blood feud to a house of mourning," Enzo's voice was a low, dangerous rumble, the theatrical rasp momentarily forgotten. "I didn't have a choice," Dante hissed, packing the marble floor. "They hit my club. They took my shipments. I had to hit back or I was a ghost anyway. I figured you'd understand. You're the legend, right? The man who never lets an insult stand." At that moment, the soft click of a door upstairs signaled Lucia's awakening. She appeared at the top of the marble staircase, leaning heavily on the banister. She looked frail, her face a map of exhaustion, but her eyes sharpened as they landed on her grandson. "Dante," she whispered, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "My boy, why are you shouting?" Dante froze. He looked up at the woman who she spent her time feeding cannoli and telling him stories of the old world in his childhood, and for a second, the Miami gangster disappeared. He looked small. He looked like a boy who had broken a window and was waiting for the blow. "Nana," he said, his voice cracking. He started toward the stairs, but Enzo stepped into his path, his hand, strong and firm, gripping Dante's shoulder. "He was just telling me about his successes in the States, Lucia," Enzo said, his voice shifting back into the soft, strained tone of a dying man. He leaned slightly against a nearby pedestal for effect. "He came as soon as he heard about us. He's just emotional." Lucia descended the stairs slowly, her gaze moving from Enzo's feigned frailty to Dante's panicked sweat. She was too smart for this. She had lived among wolves long enough to know when one was being hunted. She reached the bottom and took Dante's face in her hands. "You are bleeding," she said, her thumb tracing a small, jagged cut on his hairline. "And you are shaking. Who is following you, Dante?" "No one, Nana, I just—" "Don't lie to a woman who is closer to God than you are," she interrupted, her voice gentle but unbreakable. She looked at Enzo, her eyes narrowing. "Enzo, tell me why our grandson looks like he's seen the Reaper." Enzo felt the walls closing in. He was maintaining a massive lie about his own health, trying to comfort a dying woman, and now he had to manage a violent tactical crisis without revealing that he was perfectly capable of snapping a man's neck. If he handled the Valenti brothers with his usual efficiency, Lucia would see the lie. He was supposed to be a man whose heart couldn't handle a flight of stairs, let alone a gunfight. "He's had a disagreement with some business associates," Lucia, Enzo said, choosing his words like he was walking on glass. "It's nothing I can't handle from the desk." "You can't handle anything from a desk anymore, Enzo," Lucia said, her voice filled with a heartbreaking pity. "You can barely stand. Dante, you have brought your mess to a man who has no strength left to clean it for you." Dante looked at Enzo, confused. He had heard the rumors of his grandfather's illness, but seeing the lion leaning on a pedestal, looking pale and breathless, was a shock that hit him harder than a Valenti bullet. No, I didn't think it was this bad. I thought you'd always be the one to fix it." "The time for fixing things is over," Enzo said, his heart hammering with a robust, healthy rhythm that felt like a drum of war. He looked out the window at the long driveway. He could almost see the dust clouds of the approaching cars. He was trapped. If he stayed the invalid, his grandson would die on his doorstep, and the villa, Lucia's sanctuary, would be stained with blood. If he became the Don, he would lose the only thing that mattered, Lucia's belief that they were leaving this world together. "Go to the kitchen, Dante," Lucia commanded. "Eat something. Hide your car in the grove. If death is coming to this house, it will have to wait its turn. We have enough of it here already." As Dante retreated, Lucia turned to Enzo. She stepped close, her forehead resting against his chest. She couldn't hear the roar of his healthy heart over the sound of her own labored breathing, but she felt his tension. "You're worried," she whispered. "I am tired, Lucia," he lied, his hand stroking her hair. "We have to protect him, Enzo. One last act of the Morty family, even if it takes the last of what we have." Enzo looked over her head at the doors he had once used to keep the world at bay. He realized then that the greatest heist, stealing more moments with Lucia, was about to get a lot more expensive. He wasn't just faking a death anymore. He was going to have to find a way to fight a war while pretending to be a ghost. As the first black SUV appeared at the gate, Enzo felt the adrenaline flood his system. He didn't feel like a man with 6 months to live. He felt like a man with 1 hour to kill. He gently led Lucia toward the sitting room, his mind already calculating trajectories and blind spots, all while maintaining the slow, shuffling gait of a man who was already halfway to the grave. The quiet sanctuary was gone. The heat of Miami had arrived in the cool hills of Sicily, And Enzo Moretti was about to find out exactly how much a lie was worth when the bullets started to fly. The villa had become a labyrinth of competing shadows, and Enzo was the architect losing his way in the dark. In the days following Dante's explosive arrival, the quiet, salt-crusted sanctuary of the Moretti estate transformed into a theater of the absurd. Enzo found himself trapped in a grueling cycle of performances, oscillating between the frail, dying husband Lucia needed to see, and the iron-fisted patriarch required to keep his hot-headed grandson from starting a war on the front lawn. Every morning, the deception began with the rattle of a pill bottle. Enzo would sit by Lucia's bedside, his face powdered with a light dusting of flour to simulate the pallor of a failing heart, and they would take their medicine together. She took morphine for the gnawing ache in her bones. He took sugar pills for a phantom arrhythmia. "We are like two clocks winding down at the same second," Lucia whispered one morning, her hand trembling as she reached for his. "I can feel your heart fluttering, Enzo. Even when we don't speak, I feel your struggle." Enzo squeezed her hand, his own pulse thundering with a health so vibrant it felt like a scream. "It's the rhythm of the end, Cara," he lied, the words tasting like copper. "The engine is tired." But the moment he stepped out of her room and closed the door, the mask had to shift. Downstairs, Dante was packing the library like a caged leopard, his presence a magnet for the very violence Enzo had spent a decade outrunning. The Valenti brother scouts had been spotted in the village, their black SUVs idling near the piazza, yet Enzo had to manage the threat from a seated position, feigning a shortness of breath every time a servant passed by. "You're letting them disrespect us, no," Dante hissed, slamming a fist into a mahogany bookshelf. "They're at the gates. Give me the codes to the armory. Give me the names of the men in Palermo who still owe us. You're acting like you're already in the ground." Enzo leaned heavily against the desk, forcing a wheeze into his chest. "In this house, we do not invite the devil to dinner, Dante. We wait. We are too weak for a frontal assault." "I am not weak," Dante shouted, his Miami bravado clashing with the somber Sicilian air. "Maybe you are. Maybe the stories were just stories." The insult stung more than it should have, but Enzo couldn't defend his honor without revealing his vitality. He had to endure the contempt of his own blood to maintain the peace of his wife's soul. It was a staggering price. The comedy of his fainting spells had turned into a suffocating trap. He was now a man who had to watch his grandson ruin his legacy because he was too committed to a lie to stand up straight. To make matters worse, Silvio was never far away. The old consigliere had taken to dropping by with various Sicilian delicacies, his sharp eyes lingering on Enzo with a predatory curiosity. "Another pastry, Enzo?" Silvio asked one afternoon, holding out a cannolo bursting with sweetened ricotta. A man with a failing valve usually finds dairy a bit taxing, yet you've had 3. Enzo coughed into a silk handkerchief, surreptitiously checking for the fake blood he'd taken to dabbing on the fabric with a bit of beet juice. "The body craves what it lacks, Silvio, sugar for the soul." "And the cigar smoke I smelled on the terrace this morning," Silvio's voice was a low, rhythmic rasp. "Does the soul crave tobacco too, or is it just the lungs of a man who isn't actually dying?" Enzo didn't look up, he couldn't. "The air is thick today, you're imagining things." "I imagine many things," Silvio said, leaning in so close Enzo could smell the old man's peppermint and iron. "I imagine a woman who is truly, honestly facing her end, and a husband who is so terrified of the grief that he is playing a game of dress-up. Be careful, Enzo. Lucia is fatting, but she is not blind. If she catches you in this web, the last thing she feels won't be peace. It will be the betrayal of the only man she ever trusted." The weight of Silvio's words stayed with Enzo as he returned to Lucia's side that evening. Her condition was visibly worsening. The jasmine scent of her perfume was now consistently overtaken by the heavy, sweet smell of decay. She was slipping, her periods of wakefulness growing shorter, her voice thinning until it was barely a sigh. As he sat by her bed, the duality of his life reached a breaking point. Outside the window, he saw the headlights of a car turning into the long driveway. Dante was sneaking out again, likely to meet a contact and escalate the feud with the Valentines. Enzo wanted to bolt upright, grab his jacket, and drag the boy back by his hair. He wanted to scream at Silvio to mind his own business. He wanted to tell Lucia the truth, that he was strong, that he was here, that he would carry her through the fire if he had to. Instead, he sat in the armchair, hunched over, clutching his chest in a choreographed display of agony as Lucia opened her eyes. "Enzo," she breathed, her hand reaching out blindly. "I'm here, Lucia," he gasped, his voice thin and artificial. "I'm right here, just a little pain, it will pass." "It's getting closer for both of us," she whispered, a strange, tragic smile touching her lips. "I can hear the music, can't you? The bells of the old church." Enzo listened, but he heard only the sound of a distant engine and the mocking, healthy thrum of his own heart. He felt like a ghost haunting his own life, a man who had built a web of lies so intricate that he was now the one being strangled by the silk. The humor of his faked illness had long since evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharpening dread. He was losing Lucia, and because of his cowardice, he was losing the chance to say goodbye as the man she had actually married. He was a caricature of a dying man, a shadow playing a role for a woman who deserved the truth. And as the night deepened and the black SUVs moved closer to the villa gates, Enzo Moretti realized that the greatest heist he had ever attempted was failing. He wasn't stealing more moments. He was squandering the ones he had left on a performance that was starting to feel like a tragedy. The fever of the afternoon had broken, leaving the villa draped in a humid, oppressive stillness. Lucia sat in the armchair by the window, her body a frail silhouette against the fatting Sicilian light. The morphine had retreated for a few hours, leaving her mind unusually sharp, a cruel, flickering clarity that often comes to the dying before the final darkness. Enzo was downstairs, likely resting, or perhaps engaged in another whispered, frantic argument with Dante. She could hear the low vibration of their voices through the floorboards, a sound that should have comforted her but instead felt like a discordant note in a familiar song. For 50 years, she had known the frequency of Enzo's footsteps, the specific weight of his sighs, and the scent of his skin. Lately, however, the man she loved felt like a blurred photograph, a copy of a copy. She reached for her water glass on the nightstand, but her hand brushed against Enzo's discarded coat. It was a heavy wool garment he had worn during his collapse the previous evening. As she moved to fold it, a small, amber plastic bottle tumbled from the pocket and skittered across the marble floor. With a grunt of effort that felt like glass in her lungs, Lucia leaned down to retrieve it. This was the medication Enzo claimed was keeping his failing heart from seizing, the pressure regulators he took with such solemnity every morning. She unscrewed the cap, expecting the bitter, medicinal tang of the chemicals that dominated her own life. Instead, the bottle smelled faintly of vanilla and glucose. She shook a pill into her palm. It was a small, white disc, perfectly smooth, without the stamped numerical codes required by Italian pharmaceutical law. She touched it to her tongue. It didn't burn. It didn't numb. It dissolved into a cloying, sugary sweetness. Lucia stared at the pill as the realization bloomed in her chest like a cold ink stain. She looked at her own hands, wasted, trembling, truly dying, and then at the door through which her husband had just walked, feigning a limp that didn't quite match the muscle tone in his calves. She did not cry. A woman who has survived 3 decades of mafia warfare does not cry at a lie, she investigates it. Summoning a reserve of strength she didn't know she still possessed, Lucia stood. She used the furniture as a series of anchors, moving toward the small writing desk in the corner of the room where Enzo kept his private correspondence. She felt like a thief in her own home, her heart, the real, failing one, hammering a protest against her ribs. In the bottom drawer, tucked behind a stack of property deeds, she found the medical folder Enzo had forgotten to lock away. She opened it, her eyes scanning the reports from Dr. Vajuva. She saw the graphs of a heart in distress, the blood work indicating catastrophic failure, the signatures and the seals. To an untrained eye, it was a death warrant. But Lucia noticed the dates. She noticed the smudge on the hospital logo, a slight misalignment that suggested a high-end digital forgery rather than an official press. And then she saw the name of the lab technician listed at the bottom, G. Bruno. Giuseppe Bruno had been Enzo's preferred document forger in Miami for 20 years. The man could manufacture a diplomatic passport in 4 hours and a clean criminal record in 6. He was many things, but he was certainly not a cardiologist. She sank back into the chair, the sugar pill still clutched in her hand. The betrayal was so immense it felt physical, a weight heavier than the cancer itself. He was faking it. He was healthy. He was planning to live while she was forced to go. But as she looked at the medication again, her anger flickered and died, replaced by a devastating, hollow pity. She understood the why instantly. Enzo was a man who could kill a dozen enemies without blinking, but he could not face a Tuesday morning without her. He had created a fantasy of a shared end because he was a coward when it came to grief. He had lied not to mock her death, but to hide from his own life. "Oh, Enzo," she whispered to the empty room, her voice a ragged ghost of itself. "You fool, you beautiful, selfish fool." The sound of footsteps approached, the slow, deliberate shuffle Enzo used when he wanted to sound weak. Lucia quickly shoved the folder back into the drawer and leaned her head back, closing her eyes and letting her features go slack. She tucked the sugar pill into the fold of her blanket, a tiny white secret. The door creaked open. She felt his presence before he spoke, the warmth of him, the scent of expensive tobacco and the salt of the sea. He sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping under his very real, very sturdy weight. "Lucia," he murmured, his voice strained with the artificial rasp he'd been practicing. "Are you awake, Cara? I brought your tea." She opened her eyes slowly, looking at him. She saw the powder on his face, the dark circles he'd likely darkened with a bit of charcoal, and the way he hunched his shoulders to appear smaller. For the first time, she didn't see a dying partner. She saw an actor in the middle of a long, exhausting play. "I'm here, Enzo," she said, her voice steady. She reached out and touched his cheek. His skin was firm, his pulse beneath his jawline strong and rhythmic, like a drum beating for a war he refused to fight. "How are you feeling tonight? Is the chest still tight?" It's a struggle," he lied, looking away from her gaze. "But as long as I am here with you, the pain doesn't matter. We're getting there, Lucia, almost at the finish line." "Yes," she said, a sharp, cold edge entering her tone that he was too preoccupied to notice. "The finish line. It's funny, isn't it? How some people are so eager to reach it and others are just pretending to run the race." Enzo stiffened slightly, his hand pausing as he reached for her teacup. "What do you mean?" "Nothing, my love," she whispered, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "I'm just tired of the shadows. I think tomorrow we should go out. One last trip to the cliffs. No doctors, no grandson, no lies, just the truth of the sea." Enzo nodded, his relief palpable. "Whatever you want, Lucia, anything you want." As he leaned down to kiss her forehead, Lucia felt a surge of a different kind of strength. The strength of a woman who was no longer just a victim of a disease, but the judge of a grand deception. She would give him his last trip. She would let him play his role for one more day. But as she felt the vibrant, healthy heat of his body against hers, she made a silent vow of her own. If Enzo wanted to be a partner in her death, she was going to make him confront the reality of it. She was going to lead him to the edge of the cliff and see if the great Don Morty was brave enough to stop pretending, or if he would follow his lie all the way to the bottom. In the silence of the room, the sugar pill began to melt against her palm, sticky and sweet. A perfect, cloying metaphor for the man who was trying to turn a tragedy into a fairy tale. The morning air at the limestone cliffs of Scala dei Turchi was as sharp as a razor, smelling of salt and ancient stone. Enzo had carried Lucia from the car to their favorite overlook, his heart thundering with the physical exertion he was supposed to be incapable of. He panted heavily, over-exaggerating the strain, leaning against a sun-bleached rock as he lowered her into the folding chair he'd brought. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, projecting a man on the verge of a total cardiac collapse. "The air, it's good here," Enzo wheezed, clutching his chest, "even if it takes the last of my breath to reach it." Lucia didn't look at the sea. She looked at him. The clarity in her eyes was unnerving, a piercing, amber light that seemed to strip away the charcoal smudge beneath his eyes and the powdered paleness of his skin. She looked at the way his hands gripped the rock, white-knuckled and powerful, and then she looked at the amber bottle of sugar pills he had placed on the small table between them. "Stop it, Enzo," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried over the roar of the surf with the weight of a gavel. Enzo blinked, his hand still frozen over his heart. "Stop what, Cara? The pain, I wish I could." "Stop the play," she said, her voice dropping into a register of profound, quiet disappointment. "The curtains have fallen. The audience has gone home. There is no one left in this theater but a dying woman and a man who is too afraid to tell her goodbye." Enzo's breath hitched, and for a second he maintained the ruse, his shoulders hunching further. "Lucia, you're confused. The morphine." "The morphine makes me sleepy, but it does not make me stupid," she interrupted. She reached into her shawl and pulled out the small, white pill she had saved from the night before. She held it out to him, resting on the tip of her finger. "I tasted your medicine, Enzo. It tastes of vanilla and cowardice. I saw the records. I saw Giuseppe's handiwork in the margins of your terminal diagnosis. I know that your heart is as strong as the day we met in the lemon groves." The silence that followed was absolute. The theatrical wheeze died in Enzo's throat. He slowly stood up straight, his spine uncurling until he regained his full, formidable height. The mask of the invalid shattered, leaving behind the raw, exposed face of a man caught in a shameful act. He looked down at her, his hands trembling now, not from a fake illness, but from the sheer, terrifying weight of the truth. "I did it for you," he whispered, the rasp gone, replaced by a hollow, broken tenor. "No," Lucia said, and the disappointment in that one word cut deeper than any blade he had ever faced. "You did it for yourself. You couldn't bear the thought of sitting in that villa alone. You couldn't bear the thought of me leaving a room you couldn't enter. So you tried to steal my death, Enzo. You tried to turn my final, most private journey into a duet that you aren't invited to sing." "I didn't want you to feel guilty," he erupted, the force of his healthy lungs echoing off the cliffs. "I didn't want you to lie awake in pain thinking, I am leaving my Enzo to rot in the silence. I wanted you to feel peace, Lucia. I wanted you to believe that we were just moving to another house, together, like we always have." "Peace built on a lie is just a different kind of war," she said softly. She reached out and took his hand, her thumb tracing the calluses of a man who had spent a lifetime using strength to solve problems. "Do you think so little of me? Do you think I am so fragile that I cannot handle the truth of your survival? I wanted to spend my last days with my husband, Enzo, the real man. The man who is strong enough to hold me while I break. Instead, I've been living with a ghost. I've been mourning a man who isn't even dead yet." Enzo sank to his knees in the dirt at her feet. He put his head in her lap, his broad shoulders shaking with the first genuine tears he had shed in decades. The heist was over. The treasure, the stolen moments of shared tragedy, was gone, replaced by the cold, hard reality of his own longevity. "I am sorry," he choked out. "I am so sorry. I don't know how to be the one who stays, Lucia. I've spent my life being the one who survives, but surviving you, it feels like the ultimate defeat." "It is the bravest thing I will ever ask of you," she said, her fingers stroking his hair, her touch lighter than a breeze, "to stay, to watch, to remember, to be the one who tells our grandson who we were before we became shadows. You think the last vow was about you pulling a trigger. No, Enzo. The vow was about you being there to catch me when I fall, not falling beside me just so you don't have to watch. She tilted his chin up, forcing him to look at her. Today is our honest day. No more fainting. No more sugar pills. No more powder on your face. I want to see the man I married. I want to see the lion. I want to spend whatever hours I have left with the Enzo who is going to live. Because that is the only Enzo who can truly love me. Enzo reached up and wiped his face, the charcoal and flour smearing away to reveal the tan, weathered skin of a healthy man. He felt the sun on his face, really felt it, and the sharp, painful sting of the air in his lungs. For the first time since the diagnosis, he wasn't acting. He was just a man, terrified and grieving, sitting on a cliff with a woman who was slipping away. "What do we do now?" he asked. "We look at the sea," Lucia whispered, leaning her head against his shoulder. "And you tell me the truth about everything. Tell me about the house in Miami. Tell me about the first time you saw me. Tell me the stories I need to take with me, Enzo. And when the sun goes down, we will go home and you will be my husband, not my fellow patient, my husband." They sat there for hours as the sun tracked a slow, golden path across the Mediterranean. Enzo spoke until his throat was raw, telling her the truth of his fears, his regrets, and his undying, clumsy love. There was no more comedy. There was no more theater. There was only the sound of a strong heart beating for a weak one, and the agonizing, beautiful honesty of a man finally learning that the greatest act of loyalty isn't dying for someone, it's living for them when they no longer can. As the sky turned to a bruised violet, Enzo stood and gathered her into his arms. He didn't stagger. He didn't wheeze. He carried her with a steady, purposeful gait back to the car, his strength finally serving its true purpose, to be the pillar she needed for the final stretch of the road. The lie was dead, but for the first time in weeks, Enzo felt he could finally breathe. The return to the villa from the cliffs was marked by a silence that no longer felt like a weight, but a bridge. The theater was dark, the costumes had been cast aside, and as Enzo carried Lucia through the threshold of their home, he felt the terrifying, bracing air of reality for the first time in weeks. He was no longer a man pretending to stumble. He was a man standing on the edge of a precipice, finally looking down at the drop. He laid her upon their bed, the sheets smelling of sun-dried linen and the fatting ghost of jasmine. He did not go to his drawer for his sugar pills. He did not check his face in the mirror for paleness. Instead, he pulled a chair close to her side and took her hand, not with the trembling uncertainty of a fellow patient, but with the firm, grounding grip of the man who had once held back the world for her. "I thought I was stealing moments, Lucia," Enzo said, his voice resonant and clear in the quiet room. "I thought if I lied to the clock, I could make it stop ticking. I thought that by faking the end, I was protecting you from the loneliness of going first. But I see now that I wasn't stealing time. I was wasting it. I was spending our last hours together playing a part for a man I didn't even like." Lucia watched him, her breathing shallow but her gaze tethered to his. A small, sad smile touched her lips. "The Don's greatest heist," she whispered, "trying to swindle God himself." "I was a fool," he admitted, bowing his head. "I spent so much energy trying to look like I was dying that I forgot how to live with you while you are still here. I wanted to spare you the sight of my grief, but all I did was deny you the strength of my love." He stood and walked to the French doors that opened toward the sea. The Mediterranean was a vast, obsidian mirror tonight, reflecting a sky salted with stars. He opened the doors, letting the night breeze stir the lace curtains, bringing with it the scent of salt and the distant, rhythmic pulse of the tide. He turned back to her, and the light of the moon caught the silver in his hair and the hardness of his jaw. He looked every bit the legend he was, stripped of the powder and the pretense. "Dante is gone," Enzo said softly. "I told him to take the car and go to the safe house in the hills. I told him that tonight this house belongs only to the truth. I will deal with the Valentines tomorrow. I will deal with the world tomorrow, but tonight there is only us." He moved to the small table in the corner and poured 2 glasses of a deep, ruby Nero di Avola. a wine from the soil they had both been born from. He brought a glass to her, holding it to her lips so she could take a tiny, bittersweet sip. "To the truth," she whispered. "To the truth," he echoed, taking a long drink that burned with the heat of the Sicilian sun. They spent the hours of the night in a conversation that was less about words and more about the spaces between them. Enzo told her the things he had buried under decades of tactical silence. He spoke of the fear he felt the first time he held their firstborn, terrified that his violent world would stain the child's soul. He spoke of the nights in Miami when he had sat on the dock, looking toward the horizon, wondering if they would ever find a peace that wasn't bought with blood. Lucia, in turn, shared the secrets of a mafia queen, the ways she had manipulated the shadows to keep him safe, the prayers she had whispered into the collars of his suits, and the quiet pride she felt watching him become a man who could finally admit to being afraid. "I'm not afraid of the end anymore, Enzo," she said as the moon reached its zenith, casting a long, silver path across the floor. "I was only afraid of leaving you in a lie. I was afraid that when I closed my eyes, the last thing I would see was a man I didn't recognize. But now I see you." Enzo leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. The physical distance between them vanished, and in that closeness he finally understood the last vow. It wasn't an act of violence. It wasn't a double suicide or a tragic exit. It was the simple, monumental courage of being the one left behind to carry the light. He realized that his life, his healthy, robust, long life, was the vessel for her memory. If he died with her, her story died too. If he lived, she would never truly be gone. "I will stay," he whispered into the hollow of her neck, the words a new, honest oath. "I will be the one who watches the sun come up. I will be the one who tells the stories until my own voice fails. I will live for every second you cannot, Lucia. That is my vow, my real vow." She exhaled a long, shuddering breath, her body relaxing into the mattress. The tension that had held her together for weeks seemed to dissolve, replaced by a profound, radiant peace. She reached up, her fingers grazing his cheek one last time, tracing the lines of a face she had known better than her own. "Then I can sleep," she murmured. "The lion is awake, the queen can rest." They watched the stars together, silent and still. The night was no longer a countdown, it was a sanctuary. Enzo didn't check his watch. He didn't monitor her pulse with the frantic desperation of a man trying to catch a falling glass. He simply sat with her, his hand in hers, watching the darkness slowly turn to the gray of pre-dawn. He had spent his life stealing money, power, territory. But tonight, he had finally stolen the only thing that mattered. He had stolen the truth back from the lie. And as the first light of morning touched the crests of the waves, Enzo Moretti sat in the quiet of his home, a strong man holding a fatting one, finally understanding that the bravest act of his life wasn't pulling a trigger or building an empire. It was being man enough to stand in the rain of his own grief and watch the boat pull away. The light of the dawn was a pale, translucent gold, filtering through the olive trees and spilling across the bedroom floor like honey. It was a quiet morning, devoid of the theatrical storms or operatic tragedies Enzo had once imagined would accompany the end of the world. There were no black SUVs at the gate, no shouting in the halls, and no more lies between the two people who had outlived every enemy they had ever faced. Lucia was very still. Her breathing had slowed to a rhythmic, fragile sigh, a sound like dry silk brushing against stone. Enzo sat beside her, his posture straight, his eyes clear of the dust and powder of his deception. He looked every bit the Don, regal, formidable, and entirely present. He held her hand in both of his, feeling the faint, fluttering pulse at her wrist. It was a fragile thing, but he no longer tried to match it with a fake rhythm of his own. He let his heart beat strong and steady, a silent promise to be the anchor she needed to cast off into the deep. "Look at the light, Lucia," he whispered, his voice steady. "The sun is hitting the water. The boats are heading out from the harbor. It's a beautiful day to go home." Her eyes fluttered open one last time. They were clouded, but when they found his face, a spark of the old fire returned, a final, luminous recognition of the man who had stayed. She didn't ask for the gun. She didn't ask for the last vow as she had once defined it. She simply squeezed his hand with a strength that surprised him, a final anchoring grip before the current took her. "Stay," she breathed, the word barely a ghost of a sound. "I am here," Enzo replied, leaning down to press a kiss to her knuckles. "I am not going anywhere. I will watch the horizon until the stars come out. I will be the memory of us, Lucia, I promise." He watched the rise and fall of her chest, counting the seconds between each breath. In the past, this silence would have terrified him. He would have filled it with frantic activity or desperate deceptions. But now, the silence was a cathedral. He realized that the brave act she had spoken of wasn't the violence of a mercy killing or the cowardice of a shared grave. It was this, the excruciating, holy patience of a man watching the person who made him human leave the room, while he remained behind to turn out the lights. As the sun climbed higher, casting the shadow of the window frame across the bed, Lucia took one final, long breath. It wasn't a struggle, it was an exhale, a release of 50 years of secrets, wars, and devotion. And then the silence changed. It became absolute. Enzo didn't roar. He didn't collapse. He felt a great tearing inside his chest, a sensation of a limb being removed without anesthetic, but he remained upright. He kept his grip on her hand, keeping it warm with his own skin for as long as the law of nature allowed. He looked at her face, now smoothed of all pain and disappointment, and saw the girl from Corleone again. He stayed there for a long time, long after the pulse had vanished. He watched the shadows move across the floor, tracking the passage of a world that was now irrevocably different. He was a man with a healthy heart, a vast fortune, and a legacy of blood, but for the first time in his life he felt truly light. The heist was over. He had tried to steal time, but in the end, time had given him the only thing worth having, a truthful goodbye. Eventually, the door creaked open. Dante stood in the threshold, his face pale, his Miami bravado stripped away by the heavy, hushed atmosphere of the room. He looked at his grandfather, the man he had mocked as weak, the man he had seen faking illness, and he saw something he didn't expect. He saw a giant. Enzo stood up, his movements fluid and powerful, the lion of the Moretti family fully restored. "She's gone, Nonno?" Dante asked, his voice trembling. "She is at peace," Enzo said, his voice echoing with a new, somber authority. He walked over to his grandson and placed a hand on his shoulder. It was the grip of a man who still had a kingdom to run, but a man who would run it differently now. "And you, Dante, you will help me prepare. We will give her a funeral that the sea will remember. And then, you and I are going to talk about what it means to actually be a man." Dante nodded, cowed by the sheer gravity of the man before him. He saw now that Enzo's strength hadn't been in the guns or the money, but in the endurance of the soul. Enzo turned back to the bed for one last look. He saw the amber bottle of sugar pills on the nightstand, and with a small, sad smile, he picked them up and tossed them into the wastebasket. He didn't need the theater anymore. He didn't need the lies. He walked to the terrace and looked out over the Mediterranean. The water was a brilliant, defiant blue. He took a deep breath, feeling the air fill his lungs, the air he had once pretended to lose. It hurt to breathe, a sharp, cold ache of grief, but he welcomed it. It was real. He was alive, and he would stay alive to ensure that the name Lucia Moretti was never spoken without reverence. The Don had made his last vow, and for the first time in a life of calculated violence, he had kept it not by taking a life, but by having the courage to live one. As the salt wind caught his hair, Enzo Moretti let go of the lie and held onto the memory, standing tall against the sun, the lone guardian of a love that death could not touch. Thank you for watching. If you love powerful mafia romances filled with loyalty, betrayal, and unforgettable love stories, drop a comment, subscribe, and join the family.